Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review 3 episodes of the show Invincible. If people do not know, this is originally a Robert Kirkman image comic book that ultimately got adapted into a animated series. I thought that this show was really I thought I was really fascinated by watching this when hearing about the comic book prior to going into here. And so when I went into this show, I was blown away. Just the imagery alone, when especially you get into the consistent times where ultimately the Martians are coming in to try and attack this city, just looks insane. The imagery of it is freaking amazing, and this is a very interesting adaptation. To me, this show feels like a combination of two different things. We end up having it to where it's a combination between Kick-Ass and Black Lightning. To me, honestly, like a combination between the two. If we're going to go and really talk about superheroes and stuff like that. We end up having a character known as Invincible that seems to, in a very much, of course, kind of inherits superpowers and then eventually otherwise decides to follow in his father's footsteps. Because we ultimately have, we ultimately seemingly have kind of like a DC kind of attempt through here of like there's kind of blatantly kind of some kind of rip-offs in some point in some here parts in there of kind of like a Justice League going on within the show already. But they are to be called Guardians of the Globe. Really, though, I do like that that these characters seem very fun. It's not like it's the fact that ultimately you have to really invest and understand who these characters are and what power set that they have because it's not like given to you right away. We end up having characters like Darkwing that ultimately seems to be very much like a Batman kind of person. Omni-Man is kind of very strong and flying and all kinds of things, almost close to a Superman-esh. We end up having a character called the Immortal, which is he's kind of more like a Hulk-esh like person, very strong, and so on and so forth. And we have Red Rush, that of course is like a Flash-ish like person, and so on and so forth. Aquarius, kind of more like an Aquaman. Guy shoots water out of his hands, so he's kind of like an Aquaman slash Hydro Man kind of thing. Um, Very interesting characters. Eventually, once we get to the teen team, really we get very vastly different characters that I think that we haven't really seen all that much. I think Monster Girl is like really an amazing character that I can't wait to eventually see more of. Uh, and eventually we have it to where with all that's going on, we are also having this main character, Invincible, ultimately seemingly having or trying to have a love life of sorts. It seems that also we get some very vastly interesting characters that ultimately eventually, like an Adam Eve, that ultimately is trying to have a relationship with a character called Rex Splode, and we'll see ultimately where that explodes to. So, going into this show, I was really vastly fascinated by this show. I really got enthralled by it. It really just, through these first 3 episodes, I was like, wow, this show was amazing. To me, like, there was a lot of times where I was just like, man, this kind of feels like all jumbled together. It all kind of feels like a combination of a bunch of things that ultimately we have seen. Um, Even to the point of it being quasi like the show The Boys, because it goes to an even uh, darker kind of approach with some of the battles, where there's basically times where there are basically crushing of heads, snapping of necks, and all kinds of things, where it's very gory. There's a lot of blood. there's one scene in particular where we ultimately have it to where Invincible is having to rush a woman to the hospital because she is basically dying. Um, and so on and so forth. There's head decapitations and all kinds of things. So it is mature content. So it's not for everybody. But like I was just kind of like I was immediately thinking, I'm like, okay, where exactly is this show going to turn? And then eventually, once we started to see like heads popping off and all kinds of crazy stuff, the Mauler twins were really interesting to me to kind of just see these two characters back and forth talking to one another and basically downgrading one another, ultimately saying like, well, no, you're the clone. No, you're the clone. Well, no, I'm the original. Well, no, you're the original. So on and so forth. Um, but yeah, those Martians that end up coming in, like just the onslaught alone of these of this teen taking these things on. And there's going to be a lot of characters that I'm going to try and remember all of the names of, but it's pretty much impossible because there's so many characters within these first episodes. And so I'm going to try and attempt to name most of the ones that I can, but man, is it going to be severely difficult. Because ultimately, when looking at it, you can go and kind of find and scroll through some images that ultimately tie into certain characters. But there is also a point in time where I'm just like, okay, like I'm scrolling and scrolling and scrolling to find specific characters, and some are hard to find than others. Um, I kind of wish, again, I wish that IMDb would always have, like, if it's an anime thing, ultimately have uh, the actor, and then right next to it have the image of which that they are playing. It would be so much easier when eventually you're going into an anime thing, or you're going into a just cartoon, whatever, to ultimately quickly be able to see who any number of these people are. So that way you can either one, cast correctly if you're going to be a future caster, or ultimately just know who the by image who the person is. But anyways, I guess it's just a moot point. So going on in here, let's try as best as humanly possible to try and review these 3 episodes, because good God, is there a lot going on. So let's go into the spoilers of this. Again, if there might be at some point in time where I might just be like, I don't know who this person is exactly, so I'm going to have to try to conveniently try to leave their name out somehow, because good God, there's a lot of stuff going on here within these episodes. Amazing cast of voice acting. If you go into the IMDb of this, you'll see ultimately the guy who plays Invincible was Glenn from Walking Dead. There's any number of any actors that were from The Walking Dead that are actually on this show, but also there is just a cluster of huge stars that are otherwise on the show. We have J.K. Simmons ultimately doing Omni-Man. We have Seth Rogen playing Alan the Alien, I believe his name is, and so on and so forth. There's just an onslaught of just amazing actors that ultimately people can be very aware of. But anyways, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time getting to spoil these episodes. So we end up going on here, and the very first thing we are to see is 2 security guards. Ultimately, there's a security guard ultimately mentioning that he's going off into vacation to ultimately go to the UK with his son. It seems that ultimately his son had ultimately had some bump in the roads, but it seems that ultimately things are coming back around. We end up having this other security guard mention to this security guard. It's like, dude, you're going to miss out on all the training that we have to do. Because ultimately, like, their rigorous training now is to basically avoid people who have laser beams and all kinds of superpowers. Like, what the heck are they going to do for these kinds of training things? And so we end up having these security guards right next to the White House, evidently ushering people in. And so while that is to go on, we end up having the Mauler twins trying to break into the White House, and they end up they end up coming from the ground and burrowing their way up to eventually realize that they aren't even actually close to physically being in the White House environment. They actually just made their way right to the gate door from the underground and made their way up. Which I'm like, that's actually an amazing thing to do, to ultimately have two people that make a mistake of how far they have gone to be actually in the White House. So we end up having the Mauler twins fighting back and forth with one another, ultimately about who is the clone and who is the better one. And so while that is going on, we end up having it to where the Guardians of the Globe make their way to the White House to try and defend, but also evacuate everyone from the White House to try and protect them, which I thought a lot of this was like an amazing visual. We end up having it to where also the Guardians of the Globe are trying to also take all of the tourists or people that are kind of looky-loos, try to get them to a safe distance also, which I'm like, yeah, like how many times do you rarely see stuff like that being done in comic books or whatever? A lot of the times you end up having it to where ultimately like a Superman is ending up being like thrusted into people and knocks a lot of people down and so on and so forth, where the Guardians of the Globe go out of their way to evacuate people and try to get everyone to a safe distance, which I was utterly amazed by. I was like, wow, this is actually really smart writing. And so we go on and ultimately have the Guardians trying as much as humanly possible to take down these Mauler twins. And we end up seeing Omni-Man, who is seemingly a part of the of helping this group, but he is not actually seemingly a part of this group. And so we end up having it to where ultimately we have characters like Darkwing who come in to kind of put in gadgetry and stuff like that, which I thought was really interesting. We end up having War Woman with this like gigantic, like to me, she kind of reminds me of Hawk Girl with her like big mace like thing that ultimately she like swings around. And like I was like, man, these visuals are amazing looking. We have Immortal, who is seemingly again like a Hulk-esque like character, kind of tossing people into the sky for Omni-Man to catch and to get to a safe distance, so on and so forth. Aquarius, I believe his name is, ultimately to like try to get these watermen to be like shoved up against a wall, or to basically try to like knock them out somehow. So we also have seemingly some other character that I didn't really catch the name of, that ultimately ends up going and wrapping himself around them, quasi like a Mr. Fantastic kind of character. He's kind of a stretchy, Ash-like character. And ultimately, eventually, when they start to really start taking these guys down, ultimately that character ends up wrapping himself around them, and ultimately they eventually end up getting sent to some prison somewhere, which eventually, of course, they do escape because there is just a normal outsmarting seemingly of these two people to eventually get themselves to escape from this prison that ultimately they are in. So we eventually have it to where ultimately everyone is to be celebrating of ultimately their win. We end up having it to where everyone is really just all happy that they are, of course, been able to have beaten and been able to succeed. And so eventually we have it to where Omni-Man is to ultimately call the entire Guardians of the Globe to this location for Omni-Man to just slowly but surely kill every single one of them. Basically taking War Woman and snapping her neck, decapitating Immortal, uh, crushing and killing and taking Red Rush's head and smushing his head, because we end up having to where Red Rush is trying to fight off Omni-Man and so on and so forth. There's just an onslaught of carnage to be had by this entire group. We end up having to where Immortal and War Woman are ultimately looking at themselves and they're just like, what is up with Omni-Man? And they're like, I don't know, but it's either him or us. So they end up trying to take him down to otherwise be killed in the process. So after Omni-Man ends up killing his entire team, he ends up kind of crashing and waking up to be the seemingly only sole survivor of this onslaught that ultimately Omni-Man is completely unaware of that he had even done. We eventually have, I guess, absolutely no footage of, which I thought was absurd, of this attack, of where they were at, and I thought that was a little absurd. We eventually have a demon detective, I believe his name is Damien, kind of come in and try to assess what had gone on. But it seems that more and more he's trying to come up with clues. He's ultimately going to the Invincibles and Omni-Man's family and kind of asking questions and poking around. So we eventually have it to where, of course, this kid Invincible ultimately is to not have powers. But Omni-Man is to basically tell his son, it's like, well, hey, you'll get powers eventually. I'm sure you probably will. Or maybe you won't at all. We end up having it to where Invincible at some point is getting bullied at school. So eventually it seems that Invincible ends up going to work one day and end up taking a trash can and end up flinging it into outer space by accident. And so we end up having it to where Invincible ends up saying, well, I guess I have powers, Dad. And so we end up having it to where Invincible ends up going and evidently starting to realize that he can fly. And so while we have it to where this character can fly, he's also having some troubleshooting with flying as well. Or even something as simple as landing becomes a very hard process. We end up having it to where Invincible ends up going and basically crashing into the ground instead of actually just landing into the ground. So we end up having it to ultimately, when Invincible starts to fly off, he ends up almost going into atmosphere, and he starts to lose oxygen, and he ends up almost, or he ends up passing out to where he ends up kind of going back into Earth's atmosphere and ends up crashing onto the ground. We end up having it to where seemingly Invincible seems to be having some character problems, but eventually we end up having it to where Omni-Man ends up telling Invincible when he's a young kid that ultimately Omni-Man was a person that had came from another planet, and ultimately this planet ended up choosing Omni-Man to go to Earth to try and protect it. Kind of like a Superman story, but evidently I believe the planet isn't exactly annihilated like Krypton was. So we go along. We end up having it to ultimately Invincible ends up going and eventually seemingly having a girl that is very much interested in him, ultimately Amber Bennett. We end up having this girl ultimately seemingly trying to protect Invincible at some points, kicking some guy in the crotch to where this guy falls over because he's kind of the school bully. Eventually, when we have Invincible getting his powers, we basically have it to where Invincible just lets the bully just pound on him until ultimately the bully gets tired and walks away. We end up having it to where eventually Amber ends up wanting to be interested in Invincible. So Amber ends up taking the bully and making him give Invincible Amber's number. And so we eventually have it to where Invincible and Amber eventually date in one of these episodes. But, anyways, into the more really important parts. So we end up having it to where eventually Invincible is to start uh, he's attempting to put on certain outfits, and we end up having it to where Omni Man is just like, dude, you look so cheap. Like, dude, you have like your outfit is just awful. like we end up having it to where Invincible is kind of wearing goggles and like a bandana on his face, and I'm like, man, that actually looked really cool. I wish that they would have kept with that visual, but we end up having it to where Omni Man takes Invincible to a guy named Art, and this guy is of course voiced by Mark Hamill, which I was like, yeah. But eventually we have it to where this tailor is to tailor make superhero suits. And so we eventually have Art telling this character who's invincible. But so we end up having it to where recently Art is saying, like, well, hey, man, you don't have a catchy name yet. A catchy name could help you really figure out what suit you need. And so we end up having it to where Invincible ultimately is talking to his dad, and they are throwing baseballs back and forth, seemingly like they're bizarrely like they're throwing baseballs to the point to where it reaches like the other side of the planet and back and forth because the world is of course round. So we end up having it to ultimately Omni-Man is to uh, tell his son, it's like, well, hey, like, I know a lot of kids your age think that you're invincible, but actually, son, like, you actually are invincible, and that's hence why Invincible gets his name. So we end up pushing on to have it to be that uh, that really Invincible's first real taste of superhero attempt was to basically take out a guy. I believe his name was Killer Cannon. I could be wrong, but this guy ultimately like goes and tries to take out people, and Invincible is ending up just flinging this guy around. It's just an amazing looking visual. It's very Superman-esque, where this guy is like careening this guy through these buildings and so on and so forth. I really love the fact that ultimately we have Omni-Man that is consistently telling his son like how reckless he's being, and how like basically a lot of times how so much damage that Invincible ends up creating, like basically repetitious holes through walls and all kinds of things, like buildings crumbling because of Invincible and so on and so forth. Um, but again, pushing on, eventually we have it to where Invincible ends up seeing a Martian invasion. And so ultimately we have Invincible trying to go into the fray. And eventually he ends up noticing a woman is bleeding out. So we end up having the team um, with the leader of Robot and Duplicate, Rexplode, uh, Adam Eve, and some other characters, which I probably won't remember. Oh, and by the way, we end up having it for also, before we get to that onslaught, we end up having it for also Omni-Man has had to do two sets of funerals for the Guardians of the Globe. We end up having it uh, to where they end up doing a public funeral, which ultimately is now where these people were actually going to be buried, and a more private funeral for the actual people. So we end up having it to where eventually uh, they go and end up burying these characters, and we have a character called Cecil Stedman, which seems to be kind of the Nick Fury of this world. Him and his stealth uh, his stealth soldiers that are ultimately to try and have it to where when Invincible goes to rush this old lady to this hospital, we have these stealth-like people that are to try and take care of this woman and try to help her. So we have it to where ultimately Invincible is just basically covered with blood. We end up having this teen ending up having a very hard time trying to take down this Martian onslaught. Like, looking at it, we end up having it to where Rexplode is trying to like toss as much items as he can to go, and like he's kind of like a Gambit in a way, where we end up having this character kind of just tossing all kinds of things to ultimately have them be lit up and otherwise explode all these people. Like this, the image of all of this is just freaking just amazing. We end up having it to where the team is are basically probably going to lose every single time these Martians are to come out. And so the first time around, they end up kind of just barely making it out of this Martian attack, because we end up having it to where ultimately the Martians end up starting to really rapidly age and start to die off one by one. And then eventually they end up going back into their wormhole or whatever to go back to their planet. So we end up having it to where the team are like, oh, thank God, because we weren't going to make it out alive out of this. And so we end up having it to where the team, it's like, well, hey guys, like, you're the only real true defense against these Martians. So, hey, like, we're really impressed with your team. So how about you guys become the new Guardians of the Globe? And so we end up having Robot, who is a part of this team, and it going like, well, okay, if we're going to put a new team together, then we need to try to get the cream of the crop to audition for this team. And eventually we end up having it to where also Invincible ends up going to school one day, and he ends up seeing Adam Eve ultimately at his school, and he ends up kind of pointing out and saying like, hey, like, are you Adam Eve? Like, are you? And ultimately they end up kind of saying, oh yeah, like, and you are like Invincible. Hey, like, interesting. So they end up talking it out, and it seems that Adam and Eve and Invincible are slowly but surely kind of really spending a lot of time together. Eventually, we end up having to where Invincible is kind of at first like making fun of the teen team, because he's ultimately just like, well, yeah, you guys kind of are, like, you guys aren't exactly the top team, so maybe I shouldn't, maybe I should look for something better, huh? Like, it's like, come on, like, they're the only team that's left, and you might as well help them out. So we end up eventually having it to where while Invincible is trying to go on a date with Amber, or what is to be a study date, we end up having it to where eventually Cecil ends up trying to interrupt this date to ultimately say, hey, the world's coming to an end, you need to help. So eventually we have it to where Invincible otherwise kind of chimes in to go and help out this Martian Attack 2.0, and eventually he ends up coming back in an hour where ultimately his Amber is ultimately going and reading comic books because she has nothing better to do. And so we eventually have it to where Invincible ends up going out to the second onslaught of these Martians, and this time around it seems that the ultimately are able to there's some other villain that ends up coming to the fray that ultimately has these like bizarrish like blast bracelets, which ultimately he ends up teaming up with Adam Eve to try to prevent, which ultimately that happens at like Mount Rushmore, and it looks like there's a lot of visually interesting imagery that was going on there, and I was like, wow, this is freaking amazing. A lot of this stuff is all scattered around, but so on and so forth. So Martian Attack 2.0. So we eventually have it to where Invincible ends up going out to this second time around where these Martians end up appearing. And this time around, we end up finding out that they have some bracelets to keep them from rapidly aging. And so we end up having it to where ultimately uh, Invincible ends up going and helping out the Martian Attack, and so he ends up going and breaking their bracelets, which ultimately make them go back into rapidly aging again. And so the entire team is to notice that ultimately Invincible ends up breaking these guys' bracelets, and so we end up finding out that ultimately the team takes all the bracelets out, and then the aliens have to go yet again to otherwise go and run off back to their homeworld. Um, but it was kind of interesting that ultimately, seemingly one day for the teen team was like decades for this alien race, whereas supposedly they had taken quite a bit of time and try to make as much advancements as they could to otherwise try to come back here to try and be able to take down the teen team again. Like the robot character, the leader character, was kind of really impressed about all the advancements that they had made. So going on into here, we eventually have it to where eventually Robot is to start, and after this onslaught is over, we end up having it to where ultimately they are to audition people, and we just see these kind of like Mortal Kombat fight outs between hero and hero to see who is going to be better on this Guardians of the Globe team. And so we end up having a tour, of course, basically every single person from the team made it to the Guardians of the Globe team, and we ultimately have a tour. Invincible ends up stepping in into one battle between Rexplode and Monster Girl, and so like it seems that ultimately we end up finding out that Monster Girl seemingly is getting a schedule of how many times that she needs to be able to have practice. And Monster Girl is like, no, I can't do this. Because every single time Monster Girl ends up becoming a monster, she ultimately becomes younger. And so we end up having to where Monster Girl ultimately says, yeah, like, every single time I turn into a monster, like I de-age. So if you want to have me be a monster baby, then like you guys got to do something to have it to where I don't uh, get way too young to be able to help you guys out. So anyways, we end up like I wish there would be a way then to, instead of like a fountain of youth, like then be able to age Monster Girl. So like there's some kind of like counterbalance of if she is to get younger, maybe there's a way to escalate her age. So that way there's kind of a way to kind of prevent her from repetitiously aging younger and so on and so forth. So maybe they're going to find and figure out a way to help that character. But eventually, after this fight out, eventually we end up finding out that Rexplode is ending up cheating on Adam Eve with Duplicate, this girl that repetitiously duplicates herself. And so we end up having it to where eventually Rexplode ends up saying like, "Oh no, hey, like me going with Duplicate like isn't anything because I'm just sleeping with her cloned versions or her duplicate versions." And we end up having it to where Kate ultimately says like, "Well, any version of us is the real version," and so we end up having it to where ultimately Adam and Eve and Rexplode end up going like, "Yeah, like." Rexplode is trying to make amends. Adam Eve is just kind of like, you know what? I'm just kind of done with Rexplode. Eventually, she tries to make her way to Invincible, and Invincible is ultimately making out with Amber, and so ultimately, Adam and Eve is ultimately just like, well, good for him. Like, that he's ultimately, like, going and being with somebody. But ultimately, she's just kind of looking on and just like, meh. Like, I wish that I could have been that girl. So we end up going on in here, and so ultimately we end up having it to where Detective Demon is making his way into creepily going and seeing Omni Man's wife, and ultimately kind of like uh, appearing at their home, trying to collect evidence, creeping Omni Man's wife out, and so on and so forth. It seems like Omni Man is slowly but surely, and I like the demon detective's kind of backstory. Like we end up having it to where this demon detective uh, is trying to make amends of solving these cases to be able to make his way kind of out of being in hell kind of thing. And so I thought that that was kind of an interesting story. Um, there's a lot of things that I really enjoy and I got like a real kick out of within these episodes. I think other than that, I think I've kind of covered almost most of my bases within these three episodes. So ultimately, I'm really getting enthralled by every single one of these episodes. I can't wait for there to be more. Evidently, there is going to be an episode every Friday, so till however long that lasts. Um, but I'm really enjoying this show so far, and hopefully, we get some really cool fight outs because I've just really been impressed and really been enjoying these first three episodes. So I can't wait for more to come out. Eventually, the only problem that I have is I just wish that there was a easier way to really get to know every single one of these characters. I wish that there was like, if anything, I wish there was kind of a pausing tool to me just say, hey, this guy is so and so. Because ultimately, it just feels like you have to go into the comic books to find out who all these people are, or eventually it just kind of seems like you have to like already know all these characters to understand this world at some points. Um, but this story is so fun. This story has a lot of elements that ultimately kind of remind people a lot of things, yes. But also, there's a lot of interesting characters that I thoroughly enjoy out of this. And I'm really liking how this show is heading. It looks freaking amazing so far. So it'll be great to see where all this goes eventually towards more episodes. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.